I don't have money. If you don't have rupees, it's a different matter. So I think it is necessary to watch. But if you ask me whether we are vulnerable because of the size of external debt, I wouldn't put it by itself. I don't think it is excessive. Yes, it has increased in the last 4 or 5 years. It has increased in the last 4 or 5 years. In the years before, we could increase the reserves and keep the debt low, almost the same. Now the debt has increased, but the reserves have not increased that much. So it is a less comfortable than 5 years ago, but not to worry by itself. Then I'll come to the issue where we have to worry, and that I'll come because there is some other question on that. Is this way of explanation all right, or more elaboration, less elaboration? More elaboration. Okay. So because of this issue of external debt being controlled, there are two things that have happened in India. One, we have been avoiding borrowings by sovereign so far. But sovereign bonds are open to foreigners. Recently also they have increased so which means rupee debt. It is still rupee debt, rupee denominated. But the foreign currency risk is still taken by the government now. To the extent it is held by the foreigners. Not by the government, but by the foreign investor. But in terms of the exchange market, in terms of capital outflows, there will be impact of the exchange rate. So in a way, when foreigners come and buy rupee debt in India, the government is not bearing the forex risk. The foreign investor is bearing the forex risk. But it has an impact on our exchange rate, and therefore, as you rightly say, volatility. So the policy has been generally to keep a watch on external commercial borrowings, restrict through some policy, allow some foreign investors to come and buy the bonds in India, both corporate and government bonds, and avoid sovereign borrowing abroad so far. That's what has been done, but you may have to enter sometime or other. The question is when everybody feels comfortable. So at the moment, I think India is in a slightly better position than many years before, and I'll come to that later when necessary. Next question is, do you think that FSLRC's recommendation of shifting the regulatory power of money market from RBI to SEBI would dilute the control of RBI over Indian financial stability? I mean, that's a little narrow question, but if I want a brief answer, the main instrument of monetary policy is short-term interest rate. And to that extent, the regulation of money markets by RBI enhances its capacity to transmit monetary policy, particularly in the current context where there are a lot of rigidities in the transmission. So at some stage, that will be good. Whether it is good at this stage or not, I am not sure. But there is a bigger issue. The bigger issue is the single regulator, which is like a different issue. Single regulator, which was originally adopted starting from Bank of England mainly among the major countries, is the central bank will concentrate only on money and monetary policy. And all other institutions and markets will be regulated by a separate agency. So that experiment was done, and I think UK has given it up. It has brought it back under the central bank. The experience of global financial crisis shows that coordination is important. You can have coordination with a lot of institutions, or you can have coordination by bringing them under one institution. It depends on the culture. If it is Singapore, one institution is ideal. If it is a larger country, maybe multiple institutions, we do not know. But I think the essence is that compared to 5-7 years back, the emphasis is now not on separation, but on coordination. Whether integrated or separated, coordination is important. That is why the FSLRC has come. Now the next question is whether the FSLRC should be headed by the government or by the central bank. There are two views. One view is that the government should head the FSLRC because ultimately it is the sovereign. My view is slightly different. Usually in most developing countries, financial crisis comes at the time when there is a political vacuum or political uncertainty. So if you want to handle the crisis, it is the central bank which will have the necessary credibility, necessary will and skill to handle it. And in our own experience, I don't have time to go through it. So therefore, my personal opinion is that FSLRC should be headed by the governor if your emphasis is managing the crisis that may arise. And we have seen that unlike advanced economies where the crisis is rare, for developing economies it is always threatening, and therefore FSLRC should ideally be coordinated, headed by the central bank, but the government will be represented. But anyway, that's a matter of detail. Now comes to infrastructure. What's the proper time? No, sorry. Oh, it's already 5:15. Now how can I elaborate? I can't elaborate. No? Okay, now I'll be rather short. Infrastructure. The government of India has initiated significant infrastructure spending and has launched numerous schemes. I think it has been doing it every year since I was born. However, and this is correct, most infrastructure companies are highly leveraged, correct. PSU banks have reached senior sector limits, correct. Bailing out high NPS, correct. Given this, is it appropriate for these companies to raise more bond capital? So what should they do? We are in a bind. We are in a bind partly because I think analytically we took a wrong model for financing infrastructure. In the world, wherever infrastructure was funded, who funded? Except in USA, at least at some stage partly backed by government. It was funded essentially by government. Infrastructure has a longer term dimension, has risk, has significant public policy connotations. So usually whether it is China, whether it is East Asian countries, in Europe, banking played a role. But the banking played a role because banking had a very special position there. Now having said that, now when it came to India, fiscally we were weak. But we thought that fiscally we are weak, therefore we will hand it over to the private sector. Where is the private sector getting money? They are getting from the public sector banks. And the government also is borrowing from the public sector banks. And the government's borrowing program is funded mostly by public sector banks. So the same banks had to pay for the government, and they had to pay for the infrastructure. And if we encourage the banks to give for infrastructure, the banks did not have expertise. Our banks are not. Actually, what is the strength of the bank? The strength of the bank is not bonds. The strength of the bank is not in infrastructure bonds. The strength in the bonds is not financing infrastructure, it is financing working capital or small capital, small enterprise. Because they have a finger on the cash flow. The cash flow. So we don't have an expertise, and then so we ask the public sector banks to lend to infrastructure, which are long term, the funds are short. So I think in a way the idea that what the government should have done, I don't have money, I want to spend on something else, and therefore let us ask private sector to take it up, implement it, that the banks pay, so that was a model which didn't work. But here we are now stuck. And a lot of government money also is stuck. Government physical facilities like access, so you have to build it out. So we have to, in my view, as far as the way forward is concerned, we are caught in a situation where we have to bail out. Like America bailed out the financial companies because they are too big to fail. Our infrastructure is too critical to fail. So in some way or other, between the government and the banks, we'll have to bear the burden and structure the future financing in a better way, create better institutions. But that's a bind, and I think the price will be fairly heavy for the government, directly and indirectly, because in a way you have been captured by the agreements that you have, and the agreements themselves with the private people have been entered at a time when the government also did not know much about these agreements, etc. So I think this is a cost which you have to bear, partly because of not a very great policy, and partly because we have to learn some mistakes, and those mistakes have been committed. So if we learn, we'll be better off with regard to infrastructure. Then the question of crude oil prices, that's a very important question. Even though the crude oil prices have reduced by half, why is the Indian economy not benefiting? Why? Anybody can guess? This is a question from one of you. Why? Yeah.
Because the benefits are not transferred to the consumers. It is mostly satisfying the government. The government had huge.
Okay. So what you are saying is that the government has benefited, not the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true to some extent. They correct. That is true. But from the external sector point of view, there is a point of view. If the prices of crude had been what they were, what would have happened? BOP crisis. The economy is under stress. Our exports are not been increasing. Our imports are increasing. It is a boon. The energy prices, global energy prices coming down has saved India in the last 1.5 years. So what that leads to another question. There are three important sources of shock for India on the balance of the shock means unanticipated events are. Three sources. One, oil. Because we are heavily dependent on oil. If the oil price goes up, we don't know why it goes up, it goes up. It is our demand and supply doesn't have much to do because of our dependence. When oil prices go up, we get a negative shock. When the oil prices go down, we get a positive shock. One. Second, food, monsoon. When the monsoon fails, we got a shock. Three, capital account shock. Somebody raised this issue of debt. When the short-term debt tomorrow, America starts removing the quantitative easing, people will take away the money, or at least will not renew the debt. That has nothing to do with what we are doing, right? So these are the three sources of shock. We should always be vigilant about. So therefore, what we have to say is that don't look at whether the price is transmitted or not from our analytical point of view, from macroeconomic, from MBA students, it is tomorrow that matters, not next year, right? So basically that's different. But from macroeconomic analysis, if you're talking long term, then you have to factor in these three shocks. But at the moment, if you ask me, we are lucky that the energy prices are low. But if they are fully transmitted, then the other, in a way, the government is easing the fiscal burden by using this opportunity. So it's a relief for fisc, it's a relief for the external sector. Next question. Rate cut justification. I think very simple answer. Rate cut, nobody is sure what's right, but essentially two things. Whenever there is an interest rate is determined as much by interest as it is by factors. The borrower's interest is low interest rate. The saver's interest is? The gap between the two is of interest to the banker. They make money out of the larger the gap, more the money. So these are the various interests which keep operating, apart from government's interest, which is the largest borrower. The largest borrower in the country, it borrows perhaps more than the rest of all other people put together, and it is insensitive to interest rate. Whatever is budgeted, they will borrow. In fact, they will borrow more because the interest is higher. So you have a debt market in India where the largest player is insensitive to price. And what is that market? You call it a debt market? Where the largest player who is demanding is insensitive to price. Second, the largest player is able to force the banks to park 20% of its deposits, 25% to buy the government debt. So therefore, let us remember, debt market is good for analysis, but for a macroeconomic analysis of market operation. But we have to be very clear, these two are important discussions. Now let me move on to the next question quickly. Payment banks, I think by now you know more about it because I've been out of touch. Investment climate, again, interest rate and investment climate are similar. In the sense, in USA, what is the interest rate now? Is the investment picking up? Essentially, investment is a result of two factors. Interest rate, in a very oversimplified manner. Expected return on investment. Interest rate and the expected return on investment, and how much the interest rate accounts for in your total cost structure. So therefore, don't automatically connect the two. But investment climate is important. That's the limited point I'm saying. Finally, common perception that central banks are independent. I explained to you that I always say we are independent because the finance minister generally supports it. Inequality, that's the most important, and I'll end with that. The issue of inequality, it is true that the GDP does not measure inequality. In fact, GDP does not measure many things, and even when it measures, it does not consistent, as you know, the research. So, GDP basically measures what is measurable. Whatever is easily measurable, you have to collect the information at all India level. So whatever is measurable is included, whatever is not measurable is not included. And in one figure you can't get the output and inequality unless you give some arbitrary means. So that's a convenient measure. And it has got a lot of loopholes. Very simple loophole, I keep saying that if an unmarried man marriage is made, the GDP will come down. Yeah. There's no salary, no? If there's no salary, it's not computed, no? So with this, let me again thank you very much.